Joe and Chick are moving in.
David Gerber contacted me because I was the writing cop. I was an LAPD detective sergeant who had written 2 best-selling novels, The New Centurions, which became a movie with George C. Scott, and The Blue Knight, which was, I think, the first miniseries produced in the United States with William Holden and Lee Remick. So David thought I would be the ideal person to create the first truly authentic and gritty cop show in the history of television. Those were his words.
I can't imagine you doing anything else. Did you ever try?
No.
Well, most people try a lot of things. You're a very unusual man.
Oh, yeah, I'm so unusual. I lost my family a couple of years ago, eh? I mean, I was divorced. How's your wine? You want her in?
Yeah, it's delicious.
All this took place in 1972 when I had 12 years on the LAPD. I was still a working cop, even though I had the 2 bestsellers under my belt. I was still going to work every day. So my detective partner, Richard Kalk, and I used to drive up to Burbank Studios to talk to David Gerber and other executives about this idea he had. And I thought what David Gerber wanted it to be would have to be an anthology. We'd have different actors each week, so we could do whatever we wanted to these self-contained dramas. If we wanted to kill off the actors, we could kill them off.
Nine wife 14 to 20.
It wouldn't be a continuing family of actors as television was used to. Of course, we got the argument that anthology television is dead. We don't have it anymore. Playhouse 90 was a thing of the past. But I sort of stuck to my guns, and so did David, in arguing with the studio and NBC.
Please, freeze!
And they finally relented and said, well, maybe we could consider an anthology approach to this. The stars are no longer as important as the story is. And I'm a writer. I wanted the story to be the star, not the actors. That's how Police Story basically was conceived by David Gerber and myself, in addition to being an innovative, creative, terrific producer. He was a great salesman, and he sold it. And there we had not just the only anthology on television at the time, but a cop anthology, something unheard of.
It's up to him, lady. It's up to you. She gets it first. And you get it next, no deal.
David and I just stuck with the concept that it had to be an anthology, and in that way we could do police drama that was absolutely true to life, absolutely gritty. If a cop had to die, he died, and that was the end of that actor for that show.
Daddy?
What are you doing up, huh?
I heard you and Mommy.
Oh.
Saw you on television tonight.
You did, huh?
You were with a dead man on a boat, Daddy.
When it came time for the pilot, I informed David Gerber that I was a bit busy to be writing television. I was a full-time police detective, and I was writing novels. And I had a family, so I wouldn't be writing any television, I told him. And he was well aware of that. And I said, but here's the one thing that I insist on if I'm to be involved in this project. I don't want it to be the approach that is always taken with police procedurals. Police procedurals attempt to show how the cop acts on the job. I said that the reason I'm a success as a new kind of police writer is because I'm more interested in how the job acts on the cop.
Look, you're gonna be okay. Get a pad with all your bachelor buddies. Drink a lot. Get it on with all the ladies. Do just what you exactly do now. Except you won't have me to use anymore.
Please don't leave.
I want to get into the psychology of being a cop. I don't care about chases and shootouts and squealing tires and sirens. That isn't what makes up police work, at least not the interesting part of police work to me. It's the psychology of the job. It's the psychology of the cop. It's what happens to him after being out there on the streets and seeing not just the worst of people, but ordinary people at their worst. What does that do to the cop? Does that make him prematurely cynical? If it does, how does he go home and deal with his family? I said, I'm interested in all of that.
I know this divorce has been very difficult for you. It has for me, too. And I'd like to ease things for both of us.
Yeah, I'd like that too, Martha. I mean, it'd be nice.
We were able to get a very good writer, E. Jack Newman, to write the pilot. And in the pilot, we see a cop enduring that kind of stress. And so E. Jack Newman took all of that in and conceived of this story of a divorced cop with a daughter doing this kind of work, and how it affects him, how it affects his relationship with one of the victims that he is protecting.
You need me, is that what you call it? When I'm falling in love with you.
Wait a minute, what is that supposed to mean? Love. I just left 6 years of it. I don't even know the difference anymore.
Before Jack Newman could begin writing the pilot, I thought it would be a good idea to do something that had never been done before in television, certainly concerning cop. So my detective partner, Richard Kalk, and I put our heads together and came up with some LAPD officers who we thought were good storytellers, cops we worked with, cops we worked around, people who just seemed to have a sense, a dramatic sense for story.
We took down 187 major felony suspects. We recovered almost $5 million in monies and property, and we have a 98% conviction rate!
If the suspect lives to get into court.
Oh, live! And besides, you got somebody for all your cesspool cases.
We had the idea of pairing up the writers, not just Jack Newman, who wrote the pilot, but other writers, with police officers who would give them ideas, anecdotes, dialogue, stories for their field of interest. If a writer felt that he wanted to write about vice, we'd get him some vice cops. If he wanted to write about burglary, we'd get some burglary detectives, and so forth.
We've had another complaint from public relations on attitude. Seems some of you guys have been a little surly lately. Now just say please and sir and man, all right? And then cite the sucker and get the hell out.
My own detective partner of 5 years, Richard Kalk, became starstruck, particularly since he got involved with the New Centurions movie that was adapted from my book, and the Blue Knight TV show adapted from my book, and he got parts in both of those, and he earned a SAG card. So I actually worked with a detective partner who had a Screen Actors Guild card. Sometimes he'd show the SAG card instead of his police ID card by mistake when we were badging somebody. Richard Koch and I worked this thing so that the police officers who came in and worked with the writers would get paid by David Gerber, overtime pay, and they'd sometimes get a screen credit or even get to be an extra in the episode that they helped to conceive. So everybody liked it, but what it really did was lend a note of authenticity to this episodic television, a kind of grittiness and authenticity that had never been seen before.
And my guts are out on that street every night. We're backing you up out there. Dave, I want to make sure there's somebody backing us up in here.
Anytime you think I've stopped, pal, you just let me know.
I had a kind of unofficial job as a story editor. They would deliver each episode to my home, and I would read them and make notes and get back to them. I would keep them true, if I could, to the concept of police story. But still, the decisions of how it finally went down were made by David Gerber, Columbia Pictures Television, and, of course, NBC. David Gerber always understood the initial concept of police story, even though he would have to do battle, sometimes daily, with NBC brass, and he would come back to us, the story editors, one of whom was Liam O'Brien, and his nephew Ed Waters, and Chris Morgan, and Mark Rogers, and Stanley Kalis, the producer, and myself, and he would call us the Irish Art Theater, and he would say, "My life, I have to go to the network and fight these people for action, 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 and then I come back here and I have to fight the Irish Art Theater who wants sensitivity and poetry and police drama. My life."
Hold it, please!
The police story pilot was a huge critical success. In fact, the episodes that followed were enormously liked by the critics. We had the critics in our corner from the beginning. But I think what really happened that was phenomenal is that 750,000 press agents out there in America, publicists, carrying badges, told everyone they knew that this is the first television show about cops that's truly authentic. We had cops just singing our praises all over America. And those two things, the cops and the critics, really made this show a success.
I was watching you very carefully when you walked back across the room. Are you carrying a gun?
No.
I had the idea that policemen always carried their guns.
Well, when I first started, I'd carry a gun on duty, I'd carry it off duty, I was really gung-ho. But after a while, I began thinking it's dumb, I mean, it's heavy.
I think until Police Story came along, television watchers had never considered anything past the cop in a procedural sense doing the police work. As far as going home with the cop and seeing that he was divorced 3 times because of what his job did to him in here, that had never been dealt with before. We were presenting a show where cops were weeping because of something they'd encountered during the course of their duties That hadn't been seen before. We presented cops who were brutal. We presented cops warts and all. And that hadn't been done before in the way that we did it in Police Story in the 1970s.
First suspect acceded to Sergeant Lafrida's command. The second suspect raised his gun to a threatening position. Was he aiming at you or you?
He was aiming at me.
Why?
Well, I was closer.
What is all this, Chief?
I'm trying to determine whether there was some good police work done or bad police work done here last night.
We had an episode written by Robert Collins that directly dealt with the concept of Police Story from the beginning. It was called the Wyatt Earp Syndrome. It's something that I described to David Gerber and the other writers. It's a time in the life of a young cop, some young cops, where their badge gets huge and the badge gets heavy and they start throwing their weight around, and they even do it at home with their wives or their girlfriends or their children. And pretty soon they don't trust anybody. They don't trust their priest, their rabbi, their minister. They're prematurely cynical. All they trust is that badge and what they can do with it to show their authority. Robert Collins called it the Wyatt Earp Syndrome because the real name for it around the LAPD was the John Wayne Syndrome. And we tried to get permission from John Wayne and Bat Jack Productions to call it like it was, the John Wayne Syndrome. And we could not get permission from them to do that. So, for fear of being sued by the Duke, Robert Collins had to call it the Wyatt Earp Syndrome for purposes of that episode. But it's terrific. That show absolutely directly deals with how the job acts on the cop. The last scene in that episode shows our young cop at home after he discovers that his wife has gone, and he weeps, not quite understanding everything that's happened to him to get him to this point. And as he's weeping, we hear that stylized radio call, and it's just terrific. It's heartbreaking. I believe it was David Gerber who came up with the concept of the stylized radio calls opening each show, along with Jerry Goldsmith's wonderful theme. It was a driving theme, and the radio calls kind of mitigated it and yet made it more exciting. You kept wondering, what are these radio calls all about? And then they'd vanish, and we're into the episode.
Niven Ray, 33 clear. All units on 15, stand by, 4Y155, go ahead.
3T89, 3T89, see the man, traffic accident, 60.
Boys, I'm getting so lonely out here with no one to talk to.
Then, at the conclusion of each episode, we'd get the radio calls again. And the viewer would say, aha, oh yes. It was almost like the heartbeat of the cops, the radio calls. And it was just a very exciting idea, and it worked.
3T89, 3T89, see the man, traffic accident, 60 Oak Street and West Boulevard.
6 Mary 102, 2 Mary 11 clear. 6 Mary 2, standby information incomplete.
Finally, after 14 years with the LAPD and a couple of years with Police Story, things got to be too much for me. I had written a third book while still a cop, and that book was nonfiction. It was a true crime story called The Onion Field. And that book became even a bigger bestseller. So now I was getting so much attention, I could not function anymore as a detective. People would make up crimes to come into Hollenbeck Division police station and ask for me to solve them. And it was just embarrassing. My partners were being deluged with fans and people wanting to talk to me for ridiculous reasons, thinking I could get them a job on Police Story or something or other. And still writing books, but you know what? I never stopped writing books the way we started it with Police Story. To this day, I get together with cops and I say, tell me stories, anything that enters your mind, just as we did on Police Story. And I take them to dinner and I buy them drinks. And with the male cops, it takes about 3.5 drinks to get them to tell me good stories. Female cops are naturals and they're fearless and they can tell emotional stories, the stuff that I need. And I'm doing that this very night. And I will probably always do it because, you know, I love them, but it's tough love, so it's okay.